and the rest of the team. Okay. Now, okay, next one. And the next one. Here, now that's the current situation. The Cambrise region, etc. The new thing that's coming up is this. These are House Bills 4185 and Senate Bills 2723, 2737, which is pending. If you Google it online, you'll find copies. You'll be able to download copies. These are the Maritime Zone bills. This is the new thing. And these are the game changers, really. So, again, with respect to Attorney Bagares, between 9522 and these laws, if they're passed, this one is probably the one that you'd probably be more concerned with. Because this really changes the configuration of our sovereignty in our national jurisdiction. Compare this if you go back, okay, balik sa 2 slides. Compare this with the other one. Okay, isa pa. You'll notice certain lines are gone, certain colors have changed. And effectively, it's become more compact and a little bit more consistent. Parang naging graded na talaga. Now, this is actually what is consistent with international law. So you could say that these bills are really complying now with what is established in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. If you're purely concerned with the legal stuff, the theory of it, then tapos na yung usapan natin. But of course, probably somewhere in the back of your mind, you're already thinking there might be something wrong with that. And that's something that we will discuss later on. Okay, let's get there. The second game changer will be, next slide, RA 4153, Senate Bill 2738, which establishes archipelagic sea lanes within the archipelagic waters. You'll notice the color changes again. The reason for that is that within archipelagic sea lanes, we are supposed to allow continuous expeditions and unobstructed unhindered transit by foreign vessels in the normal mode, okay? Which is different from what vessels normally do. Because normal mode actually pertains only, can be effectively exercised only by military vessels and aircraft. Okay? Normal mode means if you're a submarine, you travel underwater. If you're a warship, you travel with your sensors and weapons on and active. You travel when you're conducting evasive maneuvers. If you're an aircraft, you travel in formation, in full combat formation with all your gear on. That's normal mode. Because after all, they're warships, so normal for them is the ability to be able to travel with the ability to engage in war. Okay. Commercial vessels do not need that. Because in any case, commercial vessels are accorded the right to pass through the archipelagic waters under the regime of innocent passage. Innocent passage is merely passage for the purpose of passing through. Normal mode, all of those things I talked about, hindi pwede yun if a warship were exercising innocent passage. So a submarine exercising innocent passage would have to be on the surface. All the weapons would need to be turned off. Even the sensors would need to be turned off. Okay? So that's why there's a very important difference here. And you already see that there is an important national security implications that are involved when you talk about allowing military vessels to pass through. Normally, you wouldn't want that. And actually, the practice of most states is to be very restrictive when it comes to military vessels. Commercial vessels, tanggap na nila. Sige, you can pass through. But if you're a warship, they don't want you coming in. They don't want a submarine coming in submerged. They don't want you to be coming in with all your weapons going around, detecting everything. That's why this is a very important bill which needs to be discussed. And these implications need to be fully comprehended. Because it's not just that. It's not really just the fact that they're allowing military vessels to pass through. The right of sea lane passage, archipelagic sea lane passage, is also available to all other types of vessels. Even though they might not need it, commercial vessels can assert it. But the types of vessels that you need to be concerned with are fishing vessels and research vessels, which also normally states try to be very restrictive about, because they don't want fishing vessels just coming in to their waters, doing all sorts of mischief. They don't want research vessels also coming in, just passing through without them knowing it, because these kinds of vessels are very different from commercial vessels. They actually can take things from your waters. Okay. Next. So you're looking at a possible future configuration within the next, 10, 15 years, assuming these will pass, maybe even less. Or something like this. Depending on what happens to the extended continental shelf claims in Vietnam Rise and maybe a claim in South China Sea if ever, this will be the future configuration there to develop. Question that is raised is, what is its implication to us? What is its implication to use the organisms? What is the implication to our people? And that is a very important question. That's a very important discussion that we need to have because they can be very serious. So let's take for an example this Biodiversity ecological sealing passage, which is actually part and parcel of, which actually signifies, it's a classic competition between international and national interest. The international interest is freedom of access, freedom of transportation across the globe, especially for international maritime trade, goods, oil, energy, etc. Most of it still goes through, travels the world by sea. And you see here the major sea lanes in this particular graphic, which is made by the European Union, European Union research paper, where they indicate the most used routes for sea transport. And you'll see, pakiclick lang one. You'll see that when it comes to the South China Sea and the neighborhood of the Philippines, something. That's where the vessels mostly pass. They pass all around us, except for some smaller number passing through their development. Okay. And the thing is, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, in a few particular provisions, is directed towards guaranteeing this freedom of movement of goods, trade for the international community. But at the same time, these routes also benefit the naval powers of the world. United States, Russia, China, in the near future China, Britain. They also make use of these routes. In addition, they make use of other routes because these are international trade routes. They are used by basically private companies. And private companies, ship captains, in deciding these routes, are driven by only one objective. Not what is the nearest route, not what is the fastest route, but rather what is the most economical route. The route that will generate the most profit. So it might be the shortest, it might be the easiest, it might be the ones that connects the most ports. It's not necessarily the most direct, continuous expeditions. That is something that military vessels and aircraft can afford to take those kinds of routes. Next. So here, for example, you see another research. Another paper from the International Maritime Organization. This is a very generalized graphic of where most of the trade passes through. And again, you'll see it passing along or around the Philippines. Next, please. And yet we're going to be implementing these archipelagic sea lanes passage, di ba? What are the national interests that are involved? This is what I see to be the national interest that we need to take into account. One, municipal waters. The 15 kilometers from the shore towards the sea is reserved by law to our small artisanal fishermen. Okay. These are their reserved fishing grounds. And you'll see that as a very, the thin green line around the islands. Okay. Next. Another major interest that we have is biodiversity. Left and right, we are a leader in the region in establishing marine biodiversity sites. So this is an agglomeration of all the different types of biodiversity sites. Some have been declared as part of the National Integrated Protected Area System, while others are still pending the process. Others are recognized as key priority areas. So if you just put all of them in the map, this is one way to represent it. But of course, this data is a little bit old. This is 2005. Also for one thing, to Batahari, which is in the middle of the Sulu Sea there, that almost shaped like an arrow here, that was in 2005. Now it's a lot bigger when the new law was enacted. Okay. The next slide, please. And of course, you cannot forget, you cannot overlook fishing. Okay. This is it's not as clear as if I had one of my other versions, but you see the red dots, those represent the areas where the fishing activity is the most intense. So these are the highest, well, these are basically indicative of the most productive fishing grounds. So those are just three. And maybe further discussions with other agencies and people can generate more possible areas of interest for people, whether you're local or national. And here you have now the archaeologic sea lanes. This is proposed to be established by the House Bill, where you will allow military vessels and aircraft to pass through, and where you hope to also limit, according to some justifications, where they want to restrict foreign vessels to pass through. Meaning we want to concentrate foreign maritime traffic in these areas. And what happens? What will happen? Well, obviously, next slide please. You have to ask, is this an appropriate route? Considering that the majority of traffic actually goes around the Philippines, who is this route going to benefit? When you look at that kind of equation, you wonder then whether this is actually going to have an impact on the so-called international maritime trade overall. That's a question that really needs to be considered and asked. And you need more information in order to ask that question. Next slide, please. This is, if you alter the data, the presentation of the data set a little bit, you'll notice that of the areas in the Philippines which are between the islands, it is true that some foreign maritime traffic does pass. But it's not on the same scale as what is outside. And it's also interesting to note that the archaeologic sea lanes that are defined in the bill do not seem to coincide with the routes which are most used. Density lang titignan mo. Dito. So you need to ask the question, why is that? Why are we trying to move the traffic around? If we're trying to move the traffic around, what for? Because then you need to consider where you move the traffic to. So next slide please. It runs over quite a lot more municipal waters than it probably needs to if you consider other routes. Next slide. It goes through major fishing grounds. Now, of course, you could say that, well, whatever you do, we will run over fishing grounds. These boats will run over fishing grounds. These lanes, wherever they are, will run over fishing grounds. So the question you need to ask is, okay, now that you know that, what are you going to do about it? Next, right. And it also runs through some of the key biodiversity sites. Tubata Reef being one of them, Apo Reef being the other. These are the crown jewels for marine protected areas because they are, one is a World Heritage Site, the other one is an area of key importance for not only the Philippines but the entire South China Sea region as a major breeding ground. And you need to ask, what are we doing when we let these vessels pass through? What are we doing to ourselves and what are we going to do about it? Okay. Next slide, please. So, the thing is, you notice, the issues are raised because if you stick only to the law, if you stick only to international conventions, requirements of compliance with international treaties, it's really a very limited way of thinking about it because ultimately, the legal discourse is what I would think of as an Orientalist discourse. We are talking about international law frameworks that have been devised primarily by Western legal academics, legal luminaries, etc. They've been driven primarily by Western legal concepts, and they have been driven to protect so-called international interests, meaning the interests of everyone else except the national. Because that actually is its job. Because international law is intended to regulate international relations. However, it's also very Western. And if you think about it, the attempt of the Philippines to assert